Yeah, thanks so much, Devra. I'm so happy they gave us such an easy question to answer. Um, so I wanted to start by telling you all a little bit about myself. So growing up, my parents had NPR on all the time, in the kitchen, in the car, everywhere. Morning Edition is still the soundtrack to my morning from time to time. And One of my earliest memories growing up was riding home from swim practice in the family's old Pontiac, or La Guinda, which we called it, which means the color of cherries in Spanish. And I was sitting in the back seat, and I was hearing over the radio that Obama just won the presidency back in 2008. And a long time ago, I was 7 years old. Um, but I remember my dad saying how much of a big deal this was. I didn't know what was going on, obviously, but this memory has stayed with me because I remember the optimism in his voice and the belief that this country was headed in a new direction. My dad was never one to put political activism on display, but one exception to that was a yard sign to protest the war of Iraq that was in our front yard for a long time, and it's still in our garage to this day. After protesting the war in Iraq for years and years, the Obama presidency appeared to my dad and many others to be a break from this violent interventionist way of thinking and a move towards peace in the Middle East. So moving forward, growing up through my adolescence, I began to remember more, to listen more to what Steve Inskeep and Renee Monte were telling me on Morning Edition, and were telling me what's happening in the world. And I'm sure I could make a whole Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire list of things that have happened since 2008, but I don't think I need to do that. I think after these experiences since then, one thing is clear, that recent presidents, for reasons in and beyond their control, have failed to live up to an enduring peace in the Middle East. And this is not a problem with recent presidents. Presidents before that have failed to, or in this regard as well. As we know, not only has the violence escalated, but on the nuclear side, countries like Iran are reviving nuclear weapons programs, which have been dead for decades. I mean, since 2003, it's crazy. And I think that the shift towards higher levels of militarization have been guided by two areas, which I wanted to talk to you about today, and I think are pretty interconnected. The first is the peace through strength narrative, and the second is the vested interests, or those who profit and those who benefit from continuing to build these weapons. So first, I'd like to talk to you about the peace through strength narrative. If you were in the Nukes and Pentagon spending breakout room yesterday, you might have heard my boss, Alan, talk about this a little bit. But what it is, it's the idea that in order for the world to succeed, in order for America to succeed, we need to prioritize dominance over deterrence. And it's also what it is. It's a narrative about peace through strength. It's a story. And along with that story comes all these terms about militarization. People use these terms in that space to justify this sort of intervention and talk about it in ways that help separate the violence from what's actually going on. So to put it in their terms, peace through strength denies the reality that we live in a multipolar world, or that is to say, that we live in a world where the United States, as was the case right after the Cold War, seemed to be the preeminent world power. Instead, I think that this peace through strength narrative really leads to peace through fear. And what it really does is that it reinforces militarism over nonviolent solutions. It diverts resources away from our social needs. It promotes global instability and results in an arms race mentality. And I think, as we all know, it results in environmental and human impacts as well. And this next administration is taking things a step further through their 2025 framework, which there are currently a whole team up in the skyscrapers in New York City putting this together. And that would involve a nuclear arsenal expansion, that under the agreements of New START, the United States has never expanded its nuclear arsenal for decades, but that could be true. We could resume nuclear weapons testing, that we could see us testing nuclear weapons openly above ground in Nevada. We could also see new modernization and nuclear weapons development, which is said to be up to $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years. And every single year, we've seen an uptick in Pentagon spending. And it's getting closer and closer to that $1 trillion annual mark, which I think is just preposterous. I think in times like these, we need to turn inwards and act outwards by focusing on a peace-centered security strategy, which I believe involves investing in peace building and diplomacy, addressing the root causes of conflict, supporting global nuclear disarmament in the long term, and prioritizing environmental stewardship. So to bring things full circle, growing up, my dad always encouraged me to find something professionally where I could do one thing, which was to alleviate human suffering. He talks about finding this own kind of satisfaction in his professional life as a Spanish interpreter and an educator. So I'd say that's my primary motivation in all this work, to alleviate human suffering. Alongside this personal motivation, I'm also deeply motivated by the work of our advocates and by our lobbyists these last few days. Just yesterday, I was training a couple lobbyists from Iowa, Carol and Rebecca. And as I was about to tell them how we go through the process, they already knew how to do it because they've been doing it for decades. And not only did that make my job a lot easier, but it was very heartening because it tells me that this work takes a very long time and we just need to keep up the fight. Working on the nukes and Pentagon spending portfolio, I've done just a little bit of work on the intersection of nukes and AI. And one quote that stuck out to me about the uncertainty and like more specifically, the fear about uncertainty comes from Alan Turing, who was one of the early pioneers in machine learning. And he said, quote, "We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty that needs to be done now." And that's the way that I look at our lobbying efforts, that even though that a ceasefire in Gaza is so critical and we need that right away, that this needs to be part of a intergenerational movement to make progress on this. I believe, as I'm sure all of you do, that peace and security can only be achieved through peaceful means. Instead of peace through strength, we need to achieve peace through peace. In our We Seek statements, we agreed that we seek a world free of war and from the threat of war. So I think at the end of the day, it's important to remember that diplomacy is not off the table and we need to treat it like that way. Thank you.
Just as a quick reminder, the query will be up on the screen and we'll have 10 minutes of silent reflection for people in the room to participate, and of course, stand up. A mic runner will come to you. If you would like to say something, if you're online, please raise your virtual hand. So the query again, how can we work towards a world free from war when new conflicts arise regularly and peaceful alternatives are denied at every turn? So I'll read it and hand it over to Ellie. What are the ways you have learned young people can play a role in affecting change on a federal level? Go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Ellie. I am program assistant for peace building. And it is such a genuine pleasure to be with you all. As I've reflected on this prompt, I've returned again and again to how rarely I see my age group, my peers, my interests reflected in Congress and in the administration. And I know I'm not alone. A 2022 national survey from the think tank Data for Progress found that 70% of people between the ages of 18 and 29 feel that they're not represented at all in their government. But while at FCNL, I've seen firsthand how young people can make their voices heard when they organize and advocate effectively. So for the past 2 months, I've been working with a grassroots group of high school students called the American Youth Association, or AYA, lobbying on the 2023 Youth, Peace, and Security Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation which tries to make young people partners for peace instead of just bystanders in or victims of US foreign policy. This is critically important because as of 2023, there are an estimated 2.4 billion people in the world between the ages of 10 and 29, which is the largest number of young people that have ever been on the planet at the same time. And 1 in 4 of these young people are directly affected by conflict, violence, crises. So to ensure sustainable peace and sustainability and stability, the United States must take an intergenerational approach that provides meaningful opportunities for young people to engage in peace and security processes. So the American Youth Association President Travis, the Chief Operating Officer Tyler are juniors in high school, but in between classes in FCNL-led lobby visits to key Republican offices. Legislative processes in the Electoral College. They host advocacy events. Their optimism and their strong sense of agency give me real hope for the future. When I was in high school, I never would have considered lobbying as a path or known how to engage Congress, hold my representatives accountable. Their work inspires me to fight harder for the Youth Peace and Security Act and for all youth around the world. So even if I don't see my generation represented in the elected officials before me, the incredible work of FCNL and the AYA and the promise of the YPS Act show me that the values of my peers can be included in policy. And then Devra, can I pass to you?
I really resonate with what you said about 70% of young Americans not feeling as if they're represented in their government. I have a background working in specifically people, and from my time working in the advocacy corps in 2022 with FCNL to working in New York out of college, organizing students around different social justice issues, I would sometimes hear from young people that they not only felt that you leaving discouraged. I know that's how I sometimes felt. However, I think it's incredibly important to remember that historically, it's young people who are first to push the status quo and who we often see spearheading some of the most monumental movements that we've seen in history. From organizing sit-ins during the civil rights movement to the key roles that high schoolers and college students played during the Vietnam War protest, and even more recently, 15-year-old Greta Thunberg, who inspired youth globally to call for climate action. And then here in the US, Parkland students leading a nationwide movement known as the March of Our Lives to mobilize young people to fight against gun control, and the historic activism that we've seen this past year from young people across the globe calling for an end to the war in Gaza. Many of us have said throughout this week, that just a year ago when we were lobbying for a ceasefire on the Hill during QPPI, that was not favorable. And even 5 years ago, it was almost a non-existent thing that that was popularly being advocated for. And I credit young people partially for that being such a push or such a change in the advocacy that we've seen throughout the last year. So when I think about the way that I see young people playing a role in affecting change on a federal level, I think what makes a key difference in young people who care about the issues and young people who care but are also willing and ready to take action to affect change is realizing two things. First is realizing the power that young people have when they do come together to fight for the changes that they want to see. And then it's knowing the roles that are available for them to play in making that change. The reality is that there are more 18 to 25-year-olds than any other age block, not only in this country, but globally. Young people truly have the power as a community to fight for the changes that we want to see for our future. But it's hard to have that perspective when you're 18, 19, or even 20 years old, even a little after that. But in my experience, I've seen young people can play an incredible role when they come together as a community. And going along with knowing the power of your community, the power that your community can have, I've seen young people become empowered to affect change once they fully understand the roles that they can play. Through my years of organizing, I've learned about the theory of change and the different roles that we can play in our activism. From the organizer, the person who enjoys bringing people together and organizing them around different actions, the rebel, who is a person who is ready to push the status quo, make some noise, maybe get in some good trouble to bring eyes to worthy causes, the helper and the advocate. Our democracy is complicated, especially for those who are just starting out and unsure of where their role is. And understanding where they fit can be intimidating. However, from my time organizing my own peers in Connecticut to students in New York, I've seen the impact that simply informing people of what roles and actual steps are available to them are, and seeing young people become empowered to take action through understanding how our democracy can work towards them is something that motivates me, is something that keeps me inspired and hopeful for the future, and something that helps me get out of bed every day to work towards ending war and conflict around the world. Because I see the power that not only young people can have when we come together, but know that more young people every day are continuing to realize that power, understand their roles, and we just see more people every day becoming more involved in pushing the changes that we want to see. And that is something that motivates me a lot. Thank you.
Thank you all. If we can put query 2 back on the screen, we'll start our 10 minutes of reflection on this query. So I'll read it again. What are the ways you have learned young people can play a role in affecting change on a federal level? On the screen, please. All right, so this is our final query. I will read it, hand it over to the people on stage, and after that, we'll settle into 10 minutes of silent reflection for the last time during this session. So query 3 reads, how do we seek atonement for those we have harmed and build solidarity, community, and hope? So go ahead.
I'm grateful that FCNL has given me, a young Black woman who was raised in Mississippi, a young Black woman who recently graduated from historically Black university, and a young Black woman whose family is only 2 generations removed from enslavement and sharecropping. My name is Katherine Jones, and I am the Program Assistant for Justice Reform and Election Integrity. For those who don't know me personally, or who are on FCNL staff, my portfolio mainly deals with the program called Community Violence Intervention Prevention Initiatives, or CVIPI for short. CVIPI is in some fashion a way to shift away from the carceral system in some capacity while bettering affected communities in order to address interpersonal gun violence. For centuries, the status quo of this country has been to encourage and create new carceral systems to push Black and Brown people into. The problem with this tradition is that the carceral system is an extension of slavery, and using the guise of the 13th Amendment to say that it is okay, and it enacts systemic violence whose predecessors are those of the enslaved. From its roots, systemic violence is maintained through actions that are neither accidental or isolated. Therefore, to fully address this query, we must start with transparency and accountability. To those who have perpetrated harm must be transparent and accountable for these actions and must recognize the lasting legacy that these have. You must be transparent and accountable because your actions have weakened trust and weakened social bonds. Transparency and accountability, however, are two-sided. They do not solely apply for those who perpetrated harm, but must also extend to the victims. Victims too carry a burden of intergenerational trauma and violence that has destabilized families for generations. And when we speak of being open in victimhood, it is not to place the blame, but to recognize the complexities that come with trauma and systemic violence. It is a counter narrative to the pull yourself up by your bootstrap mentality, a mentality that has long plagued Black and Brown communities and has become the dominant discourse. A mentality that ignores historical context, dismisses systemic barriers, and erases the humanities of affected individuals. To bring this to our question, how do we reckon with these challenges and what is our role, particularly as people of faith or as members of an organization committed to peace? For those in the Quaker community, we must grapple with the difficult truths of Quaker history. How could a peace-centered religion rooted in principles of equity and justice have played a role in the enslavement of African people? We can turn to the 17th century and 18th century Quaker world where we have actors like William Penn. These are not easy questions, but it is vital to sit in the uncomfortable when seeking atonement. However, the responsibility does not end with acknowledgement, but it continues and is sustained with action. At FCNL, my mentor Jose Moreno and I are committed to addressing these historical injustices in our portfolio. Within our portfolio, we've kept community building as a priority when it comes to community violence intervention prevention initiatives. We've let those whose lives are affected by interpersonal gun violence be the voice and faces of change, and not as a passive recipient. It is not about giving a voice to the voiceless. They have a voice, but it's underneath oppression, so we must get rid of the muffled. The prior Justice Reform Fellow, Bree Tolley, worked tirelessly to put a violence interrupter symposium on. She created a healing space for those who face community gun violence to challenge each other and to gather and lean on each other. Currently, Jose has communed with youth in New York to learn how to lobby with their member of Congress, keeping everything community-centered. And even though I'm new to FCNL, I've kept this principle of keeping community work focused with bringing incarcerated individuals home and mobilizing them to take actions in municipal and state elections to lobby against laws that have put them in prison. I also have a long-term mentor, Mr. Malik Rahim, who is a 78-year-old Black Panther Party member and the founding chapter member of the New Orleans Black Panther Party. But as you can see by the work I've listed, so far we proved that to seek atonement, it must be action-oriented and community-focused. As we take these next steps, we do so with the understanding that meaningful change is best led by those who are impacted. Those we've harmed must be at the forefront of the journey for healing and reconciliation. This is not only a model for healing, but a model for justice. Together, let's create a path forward that is both just and compassionate in the world that we seek. And now I would like to turn it over to my peer and friend, Anna Aguto.
Thank you, Katherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Aguto, and I work on the environment portfolio, as well as the Native American advocacy portfolio. And this query spoke to me in relation to both of those areas of work. As Katherine spoke about, there are uncomfortable truths regarding Quaker involvement in harm and enslavement of African peoples and federal Indian boarding schools, which is something that Rachel and I have been working on. While I'm personally not Quaker, I resonate with the values and ways of being and worshiping. I went to a Quaker school. I just finished working at a Quaker organization in Geneva, and I grew up, I have to shout out my dad who's here, with my dad, Jose Aguto, who worked at FCNL. And with his example and my mom's example, Quaker values have always been a part of my life. I come from a Catholic family and was raised Catholic, so I can resonate with tensions that exist within a religion and histories of harm, and histories of harm done in the name of that religion. Something that spoke to me when I first started working at FCNL was the phrase living or being in right relationships. It spoke to me because the phrase is asking us to think about ourselves not as an individual, but as a part of a larger ecosystem and community. And to me, it implies two things. How do we do right by each other in the moment? And how do we stay in these right relationships? Bringing this to my work, how do we seek right relationships with this world, with nature, with communities that have been deeply harmed by environmental injustices and environmental racism? How do we seek right relationships with tribal nations on their terms in light of histories of genocide, colonization, and federal Indian boarding schools? Working at FCNL so far has shown me that we can help heal from harm and build solidarity through, as what Katherine was speaking about, centering those most impacted by the harm, by embracing the dignity and respect of each person and being open to forgiveness while accepting that forgiveness cannot be demanded. Quaker values call us to recognize that of God or the divine in everyone. But right now, it feels we as a society cannot agree on who shares humanity or even has humanity. While grappling with this tension, I resonated with something that Congresswoman Barbara Lee said yesterday, that Quakers and FCNL have a sense of clarity, that amidst dehumanization, we can continue to fight for the dignity and respect of all people. I can see that in the work of the climate team as we begin to parse through what this administration and Congress will roll back from the historic Inflation Reduction Act, which has provided energy tax credits and investments in environmental justice, and prepare to lobby on what we believe can be saved. I've continuously seen it through the bipartisan work of the Truth and Healing Commission Act, which would be just a step to right relationships with tribal nations. So to answer the second part of the question of how to build solidarity, community, and hope, how do I find hope in the increasingly difficult time and polarizing world? On a personal note, as someone with family members, my grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins in Lebanon, showing up with optimism feels difficult. But I have found hope in community and solidarity that FCNL has created. I find hope in the faith communities coming together to unite and say that federal Indian boarding schools and their involvement, active involvement in them, were wrong. I find hope in Quakers standing up to injustice even when it's politically difficult. And I have found hope in the past couple of days, seeing everyone unite over the call to end aggressive arms to Israel. Thank you.